Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. In this collection of 13 diverse and compelling narratives, writers, among them criminals, law enforcement officers, and victims, elevate their personal stories of crime into high-powered literature. The book also includes an interview with Erik Larson, author of The Devil in the White City. The book that we're featuring this evening is called True Crime, Real Stories of Abduction, Addiction, Obsession, Murder, Graverobbing, and More, with editor Lee Gutkind. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Lee Gutkind.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Congratulations on a very, very different and very, very fascinating and interesting book. Congratulations on this fine book, True Crime.
Thank you so much.
Now, a few things. You're welcome. What I wanted to ask, because this book is so different and so unique, that's why I take the effort to distinguish it. And so maybe you can tell us, as an editor, who you've assembled, what kind of writers. Again, I just mentioned it briefly in the introduction, but tell us about the assembled writers, what kind of writers, because we alluded to that some are criminals, some are police officers. Tell us about the collection of writers and what was the criteria to pick these writers. Tell us a little bit about the process of picking the writers that were included in this true crime book.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because this is kind of different in many respects. And what we did, and what I did as editor, was send out, literally advertise, send out an announcement all across the world, literally, for people who had true crime stories, real, interesting, human true crime stories that they would like to tell. And I asked them, requested that they send these essays to me, and we would select. We did not commission any of these. We would select them all from kind of the big pile, the slush pile of manuscripts that we received. And we received over 200 essays from literally all over the world, mostly the United States. And they came from people who write, this is true, but also people who, as you said, have very real, they're not just writers, but very realistic backgrounds. So we have, indeed, we have two pieces from police officers. We have pieces from criminals who have been or are continually in jail. And we have pieces from journalists who decided to dig deep into crimes that were committed, horrific crimes. In one case, the massacre in Arizona, in which Gabby Giffords was almost killed. In another case, a lynching that went all the way back to Florida in the 1930s. So we have a real different collection of people.
Right, so that's very interesting how that process was of assembling authors, which is, again, like you say, very unique in itself. Usually the authors are approached, and there was a much different approach with this. Now, we did talk about that you asked for essays, so true crime books are not usually that format, that style essay. So tell us why you felt that this essay style would be more effective in this true crime collection, and why did you choose this style, and in what way did you think was going to be more effective to tell the stories?
Well,
in this true?
Yeah, sometimes using the word essay is kind of a mistake in many ways, because the book says real life stories of abduction, addiction, obsession, murder, grave robbing, and more, and that's what they are. We call them essays because they're all in what people call these days creative nonfiction format, a creative nonfiction presentation, and so that only means, I'll give you two answers to that. That only means that creative nonfiction is not only just a story, but it's a story in which you learn something about either the people involved or the subject, the crimes committed, and perhaps even the psychology behind the crime. So creative nonfiction, that's two words. The creative part is the story part, and the nonfiction is the information part. And so that's one aspect. And the other aspect is that I believe that these pieces are a cut above, from a literary standpoint, the more traditional true crime pieces that most people see and expect. It goes beyond that. We really wanted excellent, not just exciting stories, but excellent literary writing. And so we can refer to them as essays, but they're not the traditional, this is what I had to read in high school essay. They're literally packed with story and packed with information at the same time.
Yes, and the idea too is that as editor, what was your role in terms of, was it a traditional role, but what was the role in terms of the content itself, and what was your role otherwise, other than managing that content and editing that content to fit this, what your plan was for the book? But tell us about your role as editor and what that entailed.
Well, the book starts with my introduction, my editor's note, which is a long introduction, and it talks about a murder that I didn't witness, but I was close to in high school. And it turns out that it's a murder. It's a crime that I have never forgotten since high school. And it turns out that two very nice young men from I went to high school with and graduated high school with. There was a small mom and pop grocery store in the neighborhood, and it was run by seemingly people who hardly had a dime. It was a dusty store. It was a dirty store. They had very little items to sell. But the rumor, you know how these rumors go on when in high school, was that they were so dirty and so dusty and so old that they were hiding a fortune in their store. And the rumor went on, and these two young men in their late teens, right after high school, one day cooked up the idea that they wanted to rob the store, and they walked in, and one of them had a gun from his father's gun, and the gun was loaded, and they went in there, and the old people simply didn't have a dime. They were old, and they were poor, and they had no money, and one of my friends shot them both and killed them. And I thought, and these were very nice young men, and they had never been in any serious trouble before. Now, it occurred to me, what motivated these people to these kids to commit this absolutely unnecessary, ridiculous crime? They ended up with less than $20. And the whole thing made me think about the kind of essays that you're asking me this, the kind of essays I wanted, the kind of stories I wanted to publish. So real that, from the time I heard that story until even now as I talk to you, I realize that when people are in those authentic, scary, suddenly frightening situations, they could do anything. Those boys didn't walk into that store only just to kill. They went in there because they wanted some money, and the circumstances presented itself. God knows what happened in that store, but they killed the two old people. And it occurred to me that committing these awful crimes, so often happen to people who have no business even thinking about crime and never, ever purposely commit these horrific crimes. It's the circumstance that makes you do things that you forever regret. And all of us, we're all so close to making those awful decisions about that ruin our lives and ruin the lives of other people. And so when I looked at all of these 200 stories true stories that I received, I wanted to find as many true to life tales that I could, honest, ordinary, everyday people, not criminals, but everyday people who kind of went crazy, who kind of lost control at the moment when they could have walked away and done nothing. Because I think that these crimes, that murder, robbery, many spontaneous crimes are decided in a second, in a nanosecond. And it could happen to us, to you, to me, to anyone, making the wrong decision at the wrong time. And so that's kind of what I was looking for in many of these stories.
What I just found interesting in the introduction, most interesting and unique, was that you said hopefully I'm not paraphrasing, but basically you said that you had an empathy you had an understanding of what it might be to be vulnerable enough or be in a position to be a victim, but you also seem to be very understanding that you very well could have been a perpetrator as well. I found that a very interesting admission. Yeah. Now, the story that you included in here about the lynching of Claude Neal is something I had no idea about, and I think it warrants that we really use this as a really great example of the writing and the kinds of stories that are included in here. Not that they're all at this level of depravity. Of course, they couldn't. But this is a fascinating story and just an incredible story. So why don't we talk a little bit about the lynching of Claude Neal and talk about Greenwood and talk about the circumstances of a young girl named Lola that was... Take us back and tell us a little bit about Claude Neal and the circumstances that led to this shameful chapter in American history.
Well, there were, from the late 1980s until in the 1930s, over 5,000, can you imagine, 5,000 lynchings of black people in the United States over that very short period, and Claude Neal was maybe one of the most horrific. He was a young farmhand, 21 years old, and he allegedly confessed to raping and killing a white farm girl who lived on the farm in which he was working, and I say allegedly because he was the first suspect that the sheriff and his men went after, and he allegedly confessed and signed a confession with an X.
With an X.
And so whose X that with an X? So whose X was that?
Yeah.
Nobody knows. But suddenly the town, the area in Florida the people went berserk. They went crazy, and they wanted Claude Neal's blood. They wanted to lynch him and to hang him, and to give the sheriff his due. The sheriff wasn't particularly pleased with having to deal with Claude Neal, but the sheriff decided to protect Neal, took him out, snuck him literally out of town and into a neighboring town, in a neighboring jail, and tried to protect him, but the townspeople were just crazy, and they went after Claude. They went after Claude Neal, and they captured him. They dragged him into the woods. They beat him. They cut off his fingers and his toes, and then they hung him in front of a large crowd, lots of people. There were 6 people who actually did the deed. And evidently, I have not seen the photo, but evidently this photo was sold en masse for $50 to anyone who wanted it, of Claude Neal hanging from a noose, from a tree, missing his toes and his fingers, and blood, reeking, pouring out of him. It was an awful, and nobody ever knew whether Claude Neal really did this or didn't do it. But afterwards, things didn't end even at the lynching. Every black person in that area was in danger of just revenge and anger by the white folks around, and especially anyone related to the Neal family at all. And interestingly enough, the 6 people who went after, who killed Claude Neal, also went after a woman, a pregnant woman, and a little girl who was only 3 or 4 years old, and the woman was injured so much that her baby, the baby she was pregnant with, died. But the book opens, the story opens up introducing a 80-year-old character who happened to have been the 3-year-old girl who was huddled beside her mother at that point. And for all these years, the girl lived in fear and also wanted to find out who the 6 people were and wanted to bring them to justice. And her 67-year-old nephew had dedicated a good deal of his life to trying to persuade the FBI and other authorities to come back into this area in Florida and rescue and investigate and find out what actually happened. And so it starts at that point, introducing this woman, this 80-year-old woman, takes us all the way back through the awful crime and the rampage that followed against all of the Neal family. And finally, it ends up with, in the end, with the FBI finally agreeing to come back and reinvestigate.
And there's another family member, Orlando Williams, that young cousin of Allie Mae, which takes on the mantle and perseveres with this case, doesn't he?
Right. It's
now it's a different story where they are in Greenwood, Florida, though, with this. And you said there was people from 11 states. There was invitations to the lynching, women, kids. It was amazing.
It was amazing. Yes.
My point is that this shocked a lot of people, not in this area. In this area, this lynching seemed to be, just pretty normal. But again, you said how many lynchings they had in the U.S. in a short period of years. But
yes.
How did the New York Times depict this? And what was the story, how did the story, was it conveyed there in the New York Times?
I can't remember. Was it, it was conveyed generally as a terrible crime.
Sure.
And it connected to the presidency and the NAACP began to campaign to have to launch a much more serious investigation. It made national news for a long time, but it did not make a great deal of an impact in changing things or in finding who the 6 men were and bringing them to justice.
Yes, amazing. Now, you said the FBI finally gets in on the investigation. Of course, that's still an ongoing investigation, isn't it?
It's still an ongoing investigation. The 6 men are all dead, and it's the funniest thing. It's just so curious and interesting. The 6 men are dead. There are many people, however, who were related to the 6 men who are alive, and many people who allegedly, according to the author and according to the other characters, still know a lot of the details of what actually happened to Claude Neal and who actually did it. And to this day, we're talking about so long ago, people are still afraid to talk. They still do not discuss in any great detail what they know about what happened.
But the Ku Klux Klan seems to be involved in this, right?
Well, I think yes. I think that it was a big Klan event, and the 6 men were certainly Klan members, and they were certainly hooded, and it was certainly and the Klan was a major force in what happened to Claude.
And why did you want to include this story? For obvious, it's a very, very interesting story, and obviously you were reporting on the Times and reporting on
yes,
this separate views on the same thing. You got a little place in Greenwood where everybody's standing around and anticipating a lynching, and in New York Times people are aghast in horror. What overall would you like to summarize as why you would include this particular story? What would you trying to illustrate with this more than anything else?
Well, for one thing, it was horrific, and it kind of these are 13 stories, and so I wanted to give different pictures of different kinds of crime that have been and that were committed. And so this was really quite interesting, and it was the one piece that brought me back, that allowed me to provide a historical perspective. But also, again, the theme I explained to you before that to me was so important. Yes, the 6 people were the perpetrators, but as you pointed out, it became an event. So many people became involved, people who probably wouldn't have necessarily even considered being one of those 6 events, or 6 men. But the events begin to cause its own momentum and bring people who are normally people who wouldn't necessarily commit crimes of such violence come and watch and be a part of it and even make it into kind of a pageant. This is not the kind of behavior that probably most people had ever experienced before. And so again, it was this touching of people outside of the spectrum. The crime or the moment brought them in and made them perpetrators, made them part of it. I thought that was really quite interesting. And it's just amazing. This was written by a reporter for the St. Petersburg Times, the Tampa Times, Ben Montgomery, and it goes to show. People say these days also that newspaper work is dying, and newspapers are dying, and long stories, everything is dumbed down. But here we have a story that's almost 10,000 words, that it's being told by all kinds of different points of view and perspectives, and he was able to dig deeply and talk to lots of folks and kind of recreate all of the events behind the scene that so many people have forgotten.
Absolutely, and the thing is, the creative nonfiction that you're talking about too, lest people not understand, there's nothing dialogue created or composite characters, anything like that. It's just like the very best true crime is written with a lot of creative nonfiction devices as well. Again, go ahead.
The best piece of true crime, the literary true crime, the great model, of course, is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And no one has ever said, even though people have questioned his research, no one has really questioned the information that he provided. The creative part was the fact that he was able to take this and structurally and turn it into a riveting murder story from beginning to end. And he was able to interview people deeply enough so that and he conducted 400 interviews over a period of a half dozen years. So he was able to recreate validly and vividly exactly what occurred in the events leading up to the crime, during the crime, and the events after the crime. And that's what creative nonfiction writers do. We research intensely for long periods of time so that our facts remain accurate, but so that we can really present stories that are incredibly vivid and filled with details and filled with nuances that newspaper reporters who report crime often don't have the time to do. There's another long story in this book about the Gabby Giffords' murder or attempted murder as well. And it's also written by a reporter for the Arizona Republic, and this is even longer than the story that Ben Montgomery put together. And he traces back from the beginning of the robocalls when Gabby Gifford was giving a speech and was calling people together. Sean McKinnon traces back from the beginning many of the people who received robocalls, inviting them to this shopping area where she would be giving a talk. And he interviews these people and talks about how they got the call, why they decided to go to the shopping center, and what happened to them when the bullets started to pop and when the people started to fall. And not only does he talk about many of the people, give us a really inside look at many of the people who just came to hear her talk because they admired her, but we learn about the shooter early on, actually 24 hours before the event occurs, and we learn where he goes, where he tries to buy ammunition for his gun, how he got his gun, who he talked to, how he prepared himself. Sean put this story together brilliantly with incredible detail, and then afterwards, after the shooting occurs, he stuck with the story, interviewed the two surgeons from the time they got the phone call, even before they got the phone call that they had work to do in the emergency department, and follows them far beyond the day that they had to do the surgery. So what we do is we do like Truman Capote. We research the heck out of what we're doing so that we can tell stories that are so vivid and so powerful and create characters that are so real that our readers are not going to be able, we hope, put the stories down until they're over.
Why is the Giffords story, obviously she's a congresswoman, but her story doesn't end after this article either, because after this article there is another dimension to this story as well in terms of gun control, proposed legislation after the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting. So,
right.
So there's a pardon me?
Yes, that's true.
So maybe for our international audience, because we do have a big audience in Australia, England, and abroad, let's put it that way, places like Canada as well. Maybe tell us a little bit about, just give us an outline of the Giffords story itself and some of the, again, you said we cover it from every single angle. Just give us a little bit of an overview and why you felt, again, this story is important for very many reasons, but tell us why this is also a great American story, and it demonstrates a lot of things just via the story itself. It represents a lot of things.
Well, this collection shows how the most innocent and people can be hurt, ruined by crime, by murder especially, and the most prominent as well. Nobody is immune to people, to terrible things happening to them. And in this particular case, Gabrielle Giffords was a congressperson, running for her third term, and she was a Democrat, but she was a conservative Democrat, and actually a former Republican. And she was pretty popular. She was quite popular in her area around Tucson, New Mexico. And she was married to an astronaut. There's no other more respected, all-American person than an astronaut for the United States. And so they were, it was like a perfect couple. And she had quite a career, and she was very articulate, and she was attractive, and she was young, and Gerald Lochner, a young man who suffered from mental illness, was somewhat obsessed by her and decided that he was going to not only do away with himself but kill her at the same time. And he plotted it out and brought his Glock to the scene and began shooting and shot Gabby Giffords and also shot a number of other people, as I said to you before. So that's the story that's being told, but it's really an interesting story, as you've just pointed out, of what happens next, because Gabrielle Giffords has become one of the people most significant in fighting across the United States for gun legislation, gun control legislation. And, we have very, very lenient, very lax rules about guns in the United States. They're easy to purchase. You don't have to wait a lot of they're easy to purchase, and sometimes you don't have to wait to even get your license. You can buy guns on the spot. You can buy bullets, and frankly, if you want to go kill someone in an hour after you buy the gun, you can certainly get away. You can certainly try to do that here. And so for years, the Republicans, the Democrats, conservatives, and liberals, people from the western states, many respects, versus the people from the eastern states, had been fighting over gun legislation. And the other thing that's kind of interesting here, and the other dimension, is that Mr. Lochner had serious emotional problems, and the fight in the United States right now, or at least the conversation and the debate, has to do with whether we should be checking to see if people have experienced mental health problems prior to selling them the guns. And kind of looking into the records. So those are the issues that have been sparked. These are issues that aren't new, but they were really sparked by Gabby Giffords, who's slowly, by the way, heroically, slowly but surely recovering. And none of us will probably be surprised if she decides to run for office at some point, not in the not too distant future.
Right, amazing story. Now, tell us about some of the other stories. Another one I thought was interesting is Grave Robber, and you called it a love story. Tell us a little bit about that story. Give us a little overview.
Well, it's actually it's a story of a woman who falls in love with a man and the man teaches her how to make money, and while they travel, by literally robbing the graves of people in Peru, or at the same time allowing some of the people to buying artifacts from some of the people in villages that she visits. It's not as it's kind of an interesting story because it has more to do with love and lust than it does with murder and mayhem. But it's a different kind of story. And again, you have an innocent person, a woman from an middle class family who just decides to have some fun and travel and see the world, and she gets herself involved in a very difficult situation.
And tell us more about the love aspect of this.
Well, she has an affair with the man who introduced her to this, and then they don't see each other anymore. It's just kind of like a one-time, passionate, and quick incident that kind of changes her life in a significant way, and again, it's one of those incidents that could have been rather easily avoided, and really makes an impact far beyond what one ever expects. And a story that I would like to mention in the same regard is called Leviathan, and it's written by an author named David McGlynn, and it really shows how one crime, in this case an awful crime, can infect an entire town, a neighborhood, a city. Can be reverberations of a crime. An awful crime can spread far and wide and ruin people, literally ruin people, and ruin the lives of people who were only tangentially involved. So this is about a young man named Jeremy, who the writer, David McGlynn, is one of Jeremy's very good friends, and somehow and for some reason, people burst into his house, and Jeremy is killed, and Jeremy's brother is killed, and Jeremy's father is killed, and it's evidently some sort of planned murder. And you would think, for the typical kind of story, that this would turn into a police procedural, and we would find out how they investigate and how they find the perpetrators of the crime, but that doesn't occur. What we begin to learn is what happens to the people who were friends with Jeremy after the crime. So the crime is committed, the father and the two boys are killed, but then there was kind of a backlash. Jeremy was part of the swim team, so too is the narrator, David, and the entire swimming team seems to kind of lose their energy and their caring about winning or losing or participating, and kind of falls apart and kind of disbands. The whole high school swim team that Jeremy and David and all these other guys were so very much a part of. And the captain of the swim team, the star, he locks himself in his car, and he won't come out for hours, for days. And another member of the swim team drove around with his Honda car crazily. He wrecked it a couple of times. One time he had his girl in the car, and she was smashed through the window. And the captain of the swim team, a guy named Trey Smith, suddenly becomes a skinhead and joins a gang. They all kind of fall apart with the shock and the violence of the assassination of Jeremy, his brother, and his dad. And this is the way the story goes. Again, focusing on the innocent people, not necessarily the guilty people. We don't in the story ever know who killed the three people or why they were killed, but we do know that the narrator finally decides that he just can't live in this town. He's a kid still, and he can't live in this town anymore. And he was once a rather liberal fellow, didn't quite wasn't in any way religious, but what happened to him was he left his friends. All these friends were kind of falling apart, and he left town and his father and joined his father. His parents were divorced. He had always lived with his mom, but in this case he joined his father and kind of started listening to Rush Limbaugh and became became an avowed follower of Christianity, and he found that was a way out of the torment and the suffering of the impact of this murder that took place in his neighborhood. So again, I've said this before, but it really has to do with, to me, it has to do with the impact of the people who commit these crimes or the impact of the people who suffer from them after other people commit.
Yeah, I think this Leviathan was a really good example of, there's a lot of true crime books do cover the victims. They have access to the victims' families and friends.
Yes.
This was more of a psychological sort of understanding of what these people were going through, and not like any kind of profound conclusions, but just the sheer impact, the sheer weirdness that this crime seemed to deflect off all of the personalities that were very, very close. So it was almost like family of the victims. So
right,
and so
right.
It was felt within that swim team and the close friendships, and these people really had dramatic effects from this unsolved murder here. So
I wonder. Now this collection was these stories were collected a year ago, and and so often, one wishes that when they're true and they're not made up, they're absolutely positively true, real people, real names, and and it kind of makes you the stories live with you in your mind and in your head for long periods of time afterwards because they're real people. You don't usually wonder about what happens in the future to fictional characters, but you sure wonder about. Yeah, right. You're exactly right. So it'd be interesting to go back and find out what's happened to those guys now 2 years later.
Mm-hmm. Now, for this book, have any of the authors themselves done any promotion being featured in the book themselves, or is there anything like that? Are you the person that's doing the interviews, speaking on behalf because you put this together and you're the editor and sort of the organizer of this, or are these people also say? Pardon me?
I've been doing when people ask for our marketing person at In Fact Books. I'm one person that people ask for, but yes, almost all of the writers have been doing some promotion and are available for other people. If you ever want to talk to some of the authors collected here, I'm sure they'd be excited to do that with you.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that a lot of these stories are from accomplished journalists working at different various newspapers, and so these people also are continuing some of these stories or have, again, 10,000 words is being very involved with the subject, which, like you say, is kind of unusual for newspapers, especially. It's not the trend, let's put it that way.
Right. I think some of them are, in fact, continuing on. There's a story called The Addict by Lacey Johnson, and essentially Lacey is stalked and eventually eventually kidnapped by a former lover, tied up, threatened, kept in isolation for a longish period of time. She eventually escapes, but lived a terrible moment or experience with this former lover of hers, and she escaped. The police chased him until he left the country. But Lacey has now written and published a memoir of the entire, not just the event. It's called Trespasses, and it was published last year. And it was not only just she wrote about just the event of being captured and kidnapped and kept in isolation for this story, but now it's turned into a book, and that I gather is doing very well.
Oh, great! Now, why did you include that story, that personal story of the kidnapping? What was it? I mean, obviously it's an interesting story, but was there something was there some access to information that you had, again, that put a very unique spin on it, so it gave it you had a different perspective for that story?
Well, again, this woman was doing nothing but working as an editor and at one point the cashier at Kmart, and she was taken by surprise, just like so many of us could be for all kinds of different reasons, and Lord, she knew this man was stalking her. He was a former lover, and she should have known better. But when he lured her into a basement, again, to me, it's so real. It's so much like something that could have happened to me, to you, to somebody else. But and also the thing about all these stories, as I said to you, is that when I meant they were literary, I mean they're really written incredibly well. These Lacey, for example, has a PhD in creative writing. And she's now at work on another memoir. So she has a lot of experience. She studied writing for 8 years. She's read deeply into the whole world of literature, and I think that she's published significantly in many different places, and so it's a high quality look at a dirty, rotten crime.
Now, you've also included, which would appeal to a lot of true crime people, we can't get enough of this guy, and some of the subject matter that he's especially known for, Erik Larson. So for those people, again, that don't quite know who Erik Larson is in Devil in the White City, tell us just briefly what that book is who the subject of that book is, and tell us a little bit about the interview with Erik Larson.
Yeah, well, Devil in White City, I noted this week, how, by the way, that its 10th anniversary edition, 10 years after publication, has been published. And it's kind of on a certain level an exploration of, in the 1893 Columbian exposition in Chicago. And the book also tells an interesting tale of a guy, a hotel owner named H.H. Holmes, who is a serial killer, and he kind of lured attendees of the Chicago Fair, who were obviously unsuspecting, to a hotel that he built. And the hotel was equipped with all kinds of strange and kind of scary stuff, like an acid vat, a dissection table, even a crematorium. And it's a true story, completely true story, vivid and accurate. And Larson was a finalist he won an Edgar Award, but he was a finalist for the National Book Award, which is a really big deal as well. Now, since that time, he's written many of these true crime, deeply historical books. I enjoyed In the Garden of Beasts, which was, I believe, his last book, and it's about mostly about the daughter of the U.S. ambassador to Hitler's Germany in the 1930s. And she was a rather frisky person, and she had affairs with a number of German officers, and kind of ran around around Berlin during the periods of the 30s, while lots of terrible things were happening in the country and beyond. So that's his latest book. It's a fascinating book, and the interview. Well, I talked to you before about how hard creative nonfiction writers work to make sure that that they get the facts and they make sure that it's incredibly accurate. And Larson, I was astounded, I was pleased and astounded to find out that Larson is an incredibly serious researcher. It's like, to him, the whole pile of research is a big mystery that he has to go through. And one of the first things he does, as he describes in this interview, he goes to the Library of Congress, and he plants himself there. He camps there, and he goes through through tons, cartons and cartons of notes and transcripts, just as the very beginning of his research to any of his books, and spends as much time as he needs to spend doing that before he goes into the second stages of research.
And what else did you get from him in terms of commonality, in terms of the way you might approach editing and collecting and researching? Was there any commonalities, or what did you learn from this interview that you didn't know, and what did you sort of gain affirmation saying, geez, that's right in line with what I try to do?
Well, he does all this research, and he meticulously collects it, but he's looking all the time for the storylines. So as I said to you earlier, the idea of creative nonfiction is to tell a story and communicate interesting information. So the first thing you kind of try to do, and this is what Larson does, he digs up the really fascinating information, and that's terrific, and he kind of catalogs that information. But then he looks for storylines, stories that will enable him to tell his readers about the information. And then when he finds out who the characters are in the story and where the stories took place, his next step is to research the characters, find out who they are, what they look like, their habits, their friends, their mode of dress, and then he goes and visits the site. Remember, he writes a lot about history. He recreates history, and so he goes and visits the sites that his stories take place, and he slowly but surely pieces together a suspenseful, often chronological narrative to tell a story in as vivid and mysterious way as he can, to keep his readers riveted. And this is what creative nonfiction writers do, but he makes it even much more difficult. Well, he makes it much more, he takes a much more challenging situation because he's doing history. Historians for years have been writing historical fiction, but now someone like Larson has demonstrated that you can write. You don't have to be there watching anyone. You don't have to interview anyone, really. You just have to research the heck out of something and be patient and look for the stories that history and documentation will tell you. And so, and he has certain rules, like in Larson's work and also in Capote's work, he'll tell you what is, even though he has never talked to his characters, he will tell you. This is the other thing creative nonfiction writers do. If you research significantly enough and deeply enough, he'll tell you what the characters are thinking. He'll tell you what the characters might have said or did say based upon transcripts and other documentation. It's really a question of how much patience you have, how much determination you have, how deeply you are willing to go in order to flush out, to dig up every kind of morsel of information available to you.
And Erik Larson has been very successful with Devil in the White City, especially. That's probably the main reason why it's the 10th anniversary is being celebrated so much. There's now books 10, 20, 30 years old that now become the new legion of true crime classics, and that book has been around for years, and people know of it, and now it is just official for those that have not heard of the story, have not read his work. It's a certified true crime classic, so employing those techniques has worked very, very well for him, certainly.
Absolutely.
Now, some of the maybe you could just tell us all the writers that have been included in the book True Crime, and
yes,
maybe we just spoke of a couple, but tell us about all of the people that are involved and in this fine book.
Well, as I mentioned, there are a couple of police officers, and one is Vance Boyles, who is a detective, and the story he writes is called Regret. And again, a very interesting story. It's a story of an alleged rape. A woman calls and reports the fact that she was raped, and Vance Boyles, a detective, gets the case, and he interviews her, and he begins to suspect that perhaps she's not telling the truth. And so he tries to contact. He in fact contacts the young man who she is accusing, and the young man becomes very nervous. The whole idea of this woman accusing him of doing something that he didn't do, and then getting a phone call from a police officer makes him nervous. And he backs away from talking with Vance Boyles and gets an attorney and refuses to be cooperative. And all Vance Boyles the detective wants to do is to just talk to him, because he's convinced that the girl is not telling the truth, but he needs to have a statement, a direct conversation with this young man before he files his more official reports. And he knows that once he files the official report, the young man's going to get into big trouble. But the young man gets an attorney. The attorney advises him to not speak to the police officer. And Vance is a very nice, as I said, easygoing, cooperative man. And all he wanted to do was kind of go through the numbers and talk to the young man. And the young man refused, and unfortunately, he did not receive justice. He went to jail. He was tried and convicted and went to jail. And so Vance Boyles is also, I should say also to you that I mentioned to you that Lacey Johnson was a person who studied writing. There are 4 or 5 people in this book who have literally gotten degrees in creative writing, and Vance Boyles is one of them, as along with Lacey. And Stephen Church, who's part of this book, writing a lot about the savagery of Mike Tyson, teaches creative writing in California. And David Updike, in The Death of a Family, is actually the son of a really wonderful writer, and the son of one of the most famous American writers of all time, John Updike. Right. So this is a really terrific collection.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And when did this book come out, Lee?
It came out about 4 or 5 months ago.
4 or 5 months ago, right. And I guess you've been doing a fair amount of interviews for this book as well?
Been doing interviews, talking about the book, talking about the themes in the book, and the fact that these are absolutely superior pieces of literature in addition to being great crime stories.
Absolutely. Now, if people are interested, is it this is published by In Fact Books? Is it?
Yes. Where's
the best place they can? Obviously, everybody knows you can get Barnes and Noble and Amazon.com, and in Canada Chapters. But is there any benefit to going to In Fact to get the book itself, or to your website? What do you recommend? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think the best thing to do is to go to the bookstores. Your independent bookstore or Barnes & Noble, or order from Amazon. If you want any of the writers or me, the editor, to literally autograph the book for you, then you can go to the In Fact Books website.
Great.
And order from Impact directly, and just write a note or give them a call and say that you'd like me or any of the writers to autograph it, and we'll make sure that happens.
Well, that's great. Yeah, lots of times websites now offer something personal like that, so that if somebody really wants something like that, you're certainly not going to get it from Amazon. So, and that would be a nice addition to somebody that's really interested in the book and wants that collector's edition, as so many people do. I know. That's been It's been very good talking to you, Lee, about this, true crime.
Well, thank you. Nice to talk with you. Thanks for asking me to speak about the book.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure. It's people have been listening to True Crime, real stories of abduction, addiction, obsession, murder, grave robbing, and more with editor Lee Gutkind. Well, thank you very much for this interview, and hope to hear from you again real soon, Lee. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you. Good night.